Imagine this. You're a soldier in the trenches at Petersburg, Virginia, in the summer of 1864. Dawn is breaking. The air is thick, heavy with smoke and silence. Then, without warning, the ground beneath you rips open. A roar like thunder shakes the earth, and men, horses, and timbers are hurled skyward in a fountain of fire and dirt. The battlefield itself has exploded. This was not nature's doing. This was war beneath the earth. A secret tunnel, a massive mine packed with gunpowder, and one of the most daring experiments of the Civil War. But instead of bringing victory, it unleashed one of the greatest tragedies of the conflict. Friends, welcome back to our series on Civil War mysteries. If you love uncovering these forgotten and surprising stories, I invite you to subscribe and join our growing community. Together, we'll keep these echoes of the past alive. To understand how this incredible event came to be, we need to step into the long, grueling summer of 1864. Union General Ulysses S. Grant had pressed his armies deep into Virginia. His opponent, Robert E. Lee, dug in around Petersburg, protecting the railroads that kept the Confederate capital of Richmond alive. What followed was a deadlocked month after month of trench warfare, a preview of the grim stalemates that the world would see again half a century later in Europe. The men were exhausted, the trenches reeked with mud and misery, and the front lines stretched for miles. Grant needed a breakthrough. His soldiers needed hope. That's when an unusual group stepped forward, a regiment of Pennsylvania coal miners. These men had spent their lives carving tunnels through rock and clay, working in darkness, breathing coal dust. Now they offered their skill for war. Instead of digging for coal, they would dig under the Confederate lines themselves. Can you imagine it? A battle fought not only above the ground but below it. Many of you watching are over 50, and I want to ask you something directly. If you were sitting with your grandkids, how would you explain a war where soldiers became miners, where the earth itself became a weapon? This is one of those stories worth passing on. Don't just watch it, share it forward. The miners got to work in late June of 1864. Their task was as dangerous as any battle. They began carving a tunnel 500 feet long, starting behind Union lines and stretching under no man's land toward the Confederate position at Elliott Salient. The digging was done in silence. They scraped with picks, shoveled by hand, and carried dirt away in sacks. Every movement risked discovery. The Confederates suspected something, but they listened with crude stethoscopes pressed into the ground and heard nothing. The Union miners muffled their work so well that the enemy above never realized what was happening beneath their feet. Conditions inside the tunnel were suffocating. Soldiers crawled on their stomachs in the dark, air thick with dust, lit only by flickering candles. Ventilation pipes, made from wood and canvas, carried air deep underground. Without them, the men would have collapsed from the lack of oxygen. One miner remembered it felt like digging toward hell itself. Day after day, the tunnel stretched forward until finally it reached directly beneath the Confederate stronghold. Now came the most dangerous part packing the mine. The Union engineers carried in 320 kegs of black powder. They set them carefully, one after another, until over 8,000 pounds lay buried under the enemy. Wooden planks held the powder chambers firm, while long fuses stretched back to the Union lines. For weeks, whispers traveled through the camps. Some soldiers called it the blast that would win the war. Others prayed they'd live to see the sunrise after it went off. Even Grant and Meade, the Union commanders, had mixed feelings. It was a bold idea, almost desperate. But if it worked, it could tear a hole straight through Lee's defenses. Finally, the moment came July 30th, 1864. Before dawn, the miners lit the fuses. Officers and soldiers alike held their breath, waiting for the eruption that would change the war. Minutes passed. Silence. Nothing. The fuses had gone out. Imagine the tension of those men, crouched in the darkness, wondering if they had just failed or worse, if the powder would ignite at any second. Volunteers crept back into the tunnel, relit the fuses, and scrambled for their lives. At 4:44 a.m., the ground erupted. A column of fire and dirt shot skyward. The earth opened like a volcano. Confederate soldiers, cannon, and whole regiments vanished into the air. A shockwave rattled windows miles away. One witness swore he saw men hanging from shattered tree branches, torn from the ground like rag dolls. Another remembered the sound as the loudest voice of war he had ever heard. In that instant, the Union Army had achieved the impossible. A hole 170 feet long, 60 feet wide, and 30 feet deep yawned in the Confederate line. The gateway to Petersburg stood wide open. Victory seemed within reach. Friends, can you imagine standing there one moment in silence, the next swallowed by fire and earth? I do love to hear in the comments how you think soldiers on both sides must have felt in those first chaotic minutes. The explosion had done its part. The Confederate line was shattered. For a brief moment, Union victory seemed inevitable. All that remained was for the assaulting troops to pour through the gap and roll up the enemy defenses. But war rarely rewards even the most ingenious plans when leadership falters. General Ambrose Burnside, commanding the Union Ninth Corps, had a strategy. He wanted his best-trained men, the Division of United States Colored Troops, to lead the attack. These soldiers had rehearsed the assault, knew to avoid the crater itself, and were ready to swing wide around the edges. But on the eve of the battle, Union High Command intervened. They feared the political fallout if black troops led the charge and were massacred. So, at the last moment, inexperienced white regiments were ordered forward instead. The decision sealed the fate of the operation. As the dust of the explosion cleared, those troops advanced. But instead of bypassing the crater, they rushed straight into it. At first, the men were awestruck. The pit was enormous, a chasm of smoking earth, its walls jagged and steep, filled with bodies, timbers, and debris. Soldiers scrambled down inside, thinking it offered cover. Within minutes, thousands were trapped in a pit they could neither climb out of nor organize within. The confusion deepened. Officers shouted contradictory orders. Men slipped on loose soil, stumbling over the dead and wounded. What should have been a lightning strike flowed into a traffic jam of soldiers clawing through rubble. Instead of a spearhead slicing through the Confederate line, the Union Army found itself bottlenecked inside the very crater their explosion had created. The Confederates, stunned at first, recovered quickly. General William Mahon rushed reinforcements to the breach. Confederate cannon were wheeled into position on both sides of the crater. Soon they opened fire, pouring shot and shell directly into the mass of men below. Muskets cracked from the rim, sending volleys down into the pit. Soldiers described it as a slaughterhouse, a place where there was no room to fight back, only to die. Those who tried to climb out met hand-to-hand combat at the rim. Bayonets, rifle butts, and sabers cut them down. Some men begged for mercy. Others fought desperately, but the crossfire was relentless. The air filled with choking smoke and the cries of the wounded. One survivor later wrote, "The crater became a perfect slaughter pen. We were shot down like sheep." The division of black troops, finally sent in hours later, fought bravely but were pushed into the same pit of death. Many were killed even after surrendering, cut down in the fury of close combat. The Union Army's chance for a breakthrough vanished in blood and confusion. By mid-morning, the great opportunity was lost. In the end, nearly 3,800 Union soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured in just a few hours. Confederate losses were a fraction of that. What had begun with the roar of triumph ended with silence, smoke, and the terrible realization of failure. Soldiers who survived carried the memory for the rest of their lives. Some called it brilliant. Most called it butchery. History remembers it simply as the Battle of the Crater. This is where I'd like to hear from you. If you had been in command at Petersburg, would you have done anything differently? Should Burnside have trusted his trained men instead of bowing to pressure? Share your thoughts in the comments. I learned so much from hearing your perspectives, and it keeps this history alive for all of us. When the guns finally fell silent, the opportunity was gone. The Union breakthrough never came. Petersburg remained in Confederate hands, and the siege dragged on for 9 more brutal months. In the end, the war would still be decided here, but not on that July morning when victory had seemed so close. The men who fought remembered the crater not as triumph, but as graveyard. Burnside's career never recovered. Grant himself admitted the failure was one of the most regrettable moments of the war. Yet the mystery lingers. Had the original plan been followed, with trained troops leading the charge, could the Union have ended the war in 1864? Or was disaster inevitable once the Earth was torn apart? Friends, more than 90% of you watching are over 50. You are the living bridge between past and future. Please share this story with your children and grandchildren so that they too can remember how courage and tragedy are woven into our history. The Battle of the Crater remains one of the most dramatic episodes of the Civil War. A brilliant idea, born in darkness, that erupted in fire and then dissolved into confusion and bloodshed. It is a reminder that even the most daring plans can falter when human pride and fear intervene. Thank you for joining me for this story beneath the earth. If you enjoyed it, subscribe and become part of our growing community. Together, we'll continue uncovering the mysteries, the untold stories, and the lessons the Civil War still has for us today. Until next time, remember, history is not just the story of the past, it is the inheritance we pass to the future.